Right, so I'm sure everyone is really excited about the fact that we're going to start the book of Numbers today. And actually, a lot of Christians, certainly not people in this room, but a lot of Christians neglect the Old Testament. And I appreciate about our house church, we love the Old Testament, all parts of the Old Testament, even the book of Numbers. And I've been in churches where I get dirty looks when I say, let's teach the entire Bible. They say, what should we teach? Let's just teach the whole Bible. Whether we do it in 1 year or 4 years, doesn't matter. But let's teach everything because it's all useful. It's all for us. And the ultimate book that raises the eyebrows of people is when you say, I want to teach on the book of Numbers. Because I think that's the most irrelevant book in the entire Bible for Christians today. So I want to start off by talking about why it's good to study the book of Numbers, so you don't have to walk out the door in the back or not come back next week for the next few weeks here. Why should Christians study? Why should we take the time and the effort to read and study the book of Numbers? Now, I'm going to give you my answer to that question. Easy answer, Romans 15:4. Paul, after quoting from Psalm 69, says, for whatever things were written before, were written for our learning, that we through patience and hunger of the scriptures might have hope. That's how Paul looked at the Old Testament. It's all written for us. It's written for the Christians, okay? But even more specifically about the book of Numbers. Book of Exodus we'll talk a little more about this. Book of Exodus covers the 40 years in the wilderness. We talked about that when we were going through Psalm 95. And also, we're going to go through the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 7, Moses' life is broken up into 3 periods of 40 years. 40 years of prince in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness, tending the sheep of his father-in-law, and then 40 years leading the people through the wilderness on the way to the promised land. So this is the last 40 years of Moses' life. The first of those 40 years is covered in the book of Exodus, and then Numbers covers the remaining 39 years of that period. So that's a pretty significant chunk of time. And why is this period in the wilderness important for us? And I will let the New Testament writers answer that question for us. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we'll start reading in verse 24, reading the New King James. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified. So Paul's saying, this is the Apostle Paul is saying, I got to make sure that I hold my flesh in check so that I don't become disqualified for the prize. The prize is eternal life. That's what he's looking forward to. So, what question could be more important for those of us who are in the room here than what is it going to take for us who are already Christians to win the prize? What's it going to take? And then Paul goes and he points back to the story of the wilderness wanderings to illustrate what it's going to take. Chapter 10 and verse 1. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. All our fathers were under the cloud. All passed through the sea. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud of the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So think about that. He says they were all baptized. They all drank from the rock, which was Christ. They drank from Christ, but God wasn't pleased with most of them. This is pretty sobering here. Verse 6, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted.
do not become idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, these people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the end of the ages has come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. So as we look at the book of Numbers, this is talking about this period of time. So this is an example for us of learning from the example of those who fell in the wilderness, which was a lot of people, and the few who made it to the end. The encouraging, it says it's written as an example for us, but the encouragement is God is faithful. He promises, promise of God. God's faithful. He always keeps his promises. Don't worry, he's not going to allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear. So every one of us has the ability to make it. Don't give up. Don't throw in the towel. You know, I'm not 2 out of 600,000. Say no. God's faithful. Amen. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. That's a promise of God. As a young man in my late 20s, I took as a young Christian, I took a survey class on the Old Testament. It had a big impact on my life. And one of the things that impressed me is reading through the sweep of the Old Testament and the Exodus story, how significant this is for Christians. And I made a decision at the ripe old age of 28, which would be over 4 decades ago. Okay, I made a decision at that time. I said, I'm going to devote my life to studying the Old Testament, or what that part of my life where I'm not making a living and taking care of my family and doing other things, whatever available time I have. I'm going to devote a significant portion of my life to studying the Old Testament so I can learn these things and teach them to Christians, because I noticed that most Christians just focus on the New Testament. I said, wow, there are life-saving lessons in here. Okay, and in case anyone missed the subtle reference here, we have a lot of young men here who are 1 or 2 generations younger than I am, and I just threw the gauntlet down for all of you, okay? So if you have the ability to teach young men, go after it. I spent 40 years in the mines just to learn the Old Testament scriptures, and one of the wonderful benefits is you have so much better understanding of the New Testament in terms of the things that are mentioned here. So this is talked about here in 1 Corinthians. Jude makes an offhand reference to the same point in verse 5. He says, I want to remind you, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved his people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. You mean to tell me you can be saved and lose your salvation? Did we just answer that question right there, Jude verse 5, right? So they were saved, they were all baptized, they drank from Christ, but they didn't make it. They were destroyed in the end. This is a lesson for us. And then, of course, last week we went through Psalm 95 and all that it says about that in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. This is the famous line, Hebrews 3, 7 to 11. Which was referring to this time in the wilderness. It says, therefore, as the Holy Spirit says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. In the day of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tested me, tried me, and saw my works 40 years. Therefore, I was angry with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They've not known my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. So this is a universal challenge that if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Don't follow their example of disobedience. That's the point that the Hebrew writer is making in Hebrews 3 and 4, and then develops it further in the rest of the book. Don't follow the pattern of disobedience that we see in most of the Israelites in the wilderness. Another reason why it's important to study the book of Numbers, that Jesus just assumes that you know the stories in the book of Numbers. And so does Paul, the writer of Hebrews, Peter, and Jude. Let me back that up. In John chapter 3, one of the most famous parts of the New Testament, you must be born again and born in the Spirit. God so loved the world. That's all in John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, Jesus himself gives a prophecy about the crucifixion. But if you don't understand, if you've not read the book of Numbers and you don't understand Numbers, you're going to miss what he said. He said, just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. This is a prophecy contained in allegorical form in Numbers 21, in the story of the bronze serpent, about Christ. And there's some wonderful things that are hidden in that prophecy. Jesus doesn't develop it. We'll talk about that first. So Jesus assumes you know the story in Numbers 21 about the bronze serpent. To those who are listening to that, he said, well, are he speaking to Jews there? Well, Revelation chapter 2, he's speaking to the book of Revelation is written to the 7 churches in Asia Minor. So there's a lot of Gentiles in those churches in modern day Turkey. In Revelation chapter 2, he's addressing false teachers and people who will lead people into sexual immorality, and he brings up the example of Balaam in the book of Numbers. So he assumes that they know the story from the book of Numbers written to Gentiles. We discussed in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, where it talks about this time in the wilderness. And we also discussed in Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where he points back to that. And then Peter also refers to Balaam in his warnings about false teachers that are going to come into the church. And then Jude actually references 3 things from the book of Numbers in his brief letter. Not only about how God saved the people and then destroyed them because of their disobedience in the wilderness, but he also has references to Balaam and to Korah's rebellion. So if you want to understand the New Testament deeply, according to Jesus and Peter and Paul and Jude and whoever wrote Hebrews, if it was Paul or somebody else, they all assume that you know the stories in the book of Numbers. So in this book, we're going to learn about Joshua and Caleb. And I want to, after reading that passage from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I want to really understand what made Joshua and Caleb different from their whole generation. They made it into the promised land. Amen. So 2 groups of people I want to keep my eyes on. Joshua and Caleb, what did they do? What was different about them? And we'll learn that in Numbers. And then, what were the mistakes that everybody else made in that generation? So that's Joshua and Caleb versus about 600,000 other people. So you get to study both, all right? And then the other thing is in Moses. We talked about this. We're going through the book of Acts. We discussed this in Acts chapter 3. When Peter, in connection with Peter, in Acts chapter 7, in connection with Stephen, this prophecy of Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 to 19, where the Lord said to Moses, he says that I will raise up a prophet like you from among your brothers. And the point that they make there, which is alluded to several places in John, I'll put that in the notes as well, is this is fulfilled by Jesus. The prophet like Moses that God would raise up, and it was fit. He literally rose him up. He rose him up from the dead. But it would be a prophet like Moses. What does that mean? If you look at the life of Moses in detail, there is an astounding number of unusual parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus from birth to death, from beginning to end. And we have in the book of Numbers 39 years of the life of Moses. So do not be surprised. This is a little spoiler alert here. Don't be surprised if, as you're reading through the book of Numbers, you find some things that remind you an awful lot of Jesus. So as we're reading through Numbers, I want to encourage you to read on your own as we're going through this as well. Look for things in the life of Moses in the book of Numbers that remind us of Jesus. There are also a number of fascinating little-known prophecies about Jesus. We just mentioned the one about the serpent in the wilderness, but there are others in there as well. I'll give you a little taste of one of the ones that I really like in the book of Numbers. Years ago, a friend sent me a clip of a debate between a Christian apologist and a Muslim who was trying to tear the Christian faith down. So this was a debate going back and forth. And at one point in the debate, the Muslim challenges the Christian apologist with the following statement. He says, if Jesus was to be so important, if he is who you say he is, if he's the Son of God, if he's going to be so important, he's going to be the most important of all the prophets, then why isn't his name mentioned anywhere in the Old Testament prophecies? Okay? So this is the equivalent in baseball of a slow pitch right over the center of the plate, all right? And the Christian apologist didn't even take a swing at it, okay? He didn't take a swing at it. And so what that told me is this guy's never read Justin Martyr, he's never read Dialogue with Trypho, because if anyone asked Trypho the question, he would have blown it right out of the park. They never asked him that question again. And so actually the way he answers that question is by going back to a specific statement in the book of Numbers. And we'll talk about that. So this is kind of coming attractions here. This is why you need to hang on and then follow the class, right? So you're going to learn how to do that on your own. Now, if someone asks you that question, so as a prophecy, even the name of Jesus is given in the Old Testament scriptures, as well as every aspect of his life as well. So the name of the book, Numbers, that turns people off right away. I'm an engineer. We have a few engineers in the crowd here, people who like numbers, but for most people, that scares them away right off the bat because they have a bad experience with numbers, all right? The reason the book is called Numbers is because it starts off with a census. They take a head count of all the males, except for the Levites, who are 20 years and older. So it starts off with the census. And actually, I counted, I might have missed one, but I counted there are 4 different places in the book of Numbers where they're counting heads, all right? There are 2 different types of censuses, if that's a proper way to say it, of the Levites, and then there's the one at the beginning of Numbers, and then there's the one at the end of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 26, right before they go into the Promised Land. So it's kind of, the story is bookended, the beginning and the end, by a census. So, and there's a reason for this, and I'll let you think about that as we're going through this. Why is it important to have a census of all the people? And I'll throw my 2 cents in about that in the course of this series here. But a lot of people start off in Numbers chapter 1, and it's just this repetitive census discussion. A lot of people, they get through chapter 1, chapter 2, and they just say, forget it. This is boring. This is irrelevant. Let me just move on to the Psalms or the New Testament or something that's gonna be practical for my life. So I just want to encourage you, don't make that mistake. Let's press on through those parts of the Bible. Some parts of the Bible are meant to be read more slowly than others. And if you find this first part of Numbers boring, just hang in there and keep on going. The other thing is, in this class, we just went through the book of Acts, and I think we read every single word in the book of Acts during, Dave's nodding here, he keeps track of these things. So I think we hit every single word. We're not going to do that in the book of Numbers, all right? So I want to encourage everyone to read it on your own, but I want to focus on some of the highlights. So some of the more, let's say, tedious parts of the book of Numbers, we're not going to read that in the class. I think there's a little sigh of relief in the room here. Those who are familiar with the book. So I want to encourage you to read it on your own. And I want to certain things we'll talk at a high level, other parts we're going to dive in more deeply. So timeline, really important. I think the timeline of the first 5 books, the whole Exodus story, it's not that complicated. It's pretty simple, and I think if you get it, it's much easier to put the pieces together. So I want to give you the timeline and the calendar for the things that are taking place from Exodus 12 all the way through the end of Deuteronomy. It's actually incredibly simple. Let's turn to Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 6. Let's get the calendar down first. Exodus 12 is a discussion about the Passover. This is while they're still in Egypt. Starting in verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, this month shall be the beginning of months, shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to family, households, a lamb for each home. If there are too few for a household, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of souls. And then it goes down further and says in verse 6, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. So the calendar, God fixes the calendar to start. The first month is the month in which the Passover occurs. He says that this is going to be your calendar. On the 10th day of the month, you select the lamb. On the 14th day of the month, you kill the lamb. And then the people departed from Egypt on the 15th day of the month, as it says in Numbers 33:3. So it follows the story of the Exodus that the Passover, the angels slay the firstborn from every household at midnight on the night of the 14th, and then they depart at that time, and they escape Egypt on the 15th. So that's the schedule. The Passover on the 14th, and then they escape Egypt on the 15th. So this is the first month of the year. Okay, then Exodus 19. Exodus 19, they arrive at Mount Sinai, starting in verse 1. Now in the third month, after the children of Israel departed from the land of Egypt, on the same day they came into the Sinai desert. When they departed from Rephidim and came to the Sinai desert and camped in the desert, so Israel camped there before the mountain. Of course, it's Mount Sinai. So they leave Egypt on the 15th of the first month, and then on the third month, same time, they get to Mount Sinai. So how long did it take them to get to Mount Sinai? 2 months. First month to the third month. So it took 2 months to get to Mount Sinai. So basically, 2 months to get there. And then Exodus, let's turn to Exodus chapter 40. The last chapter in Exodus. So 2 months to get to Mount Sinai. In verse 15, then it came to pass, on the Exodus chapter 40, verse 15, then it came to pass in the first month of the second year after their departure from Egypt, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was set up. And then it talks about the tabernacle set up, and the glory of the Lord descends and fills the tabernacle. And that's the end of book of Exodus. So this goes to the first day of the first month of the second year. So this is basically just short of 1 year after the Passover, 2 weeks short of that. Okay, so this is very simple. In the book of Exodus, 2 months from the Passover to get to Mount Sinai, and then 10 months after that, the Lord comes and fills the tabernacle. So what happens during those 10 months is you have Moses going up the mountain a few times, and he's given the law and the ordinances. They build out all the things required for the tabernacle. They assemble it, and then the Lord descends during that 10-month period. So that happens there. And then the book of Numbers picks up right immediately after that. Actually, Numbers is not quite in chronological order exactly. It starts with the census, but let's start with Numbers chapter 9. All right, so Lord came down first day, first month, second year. So this is a year, it's almost a year after the Passover when they left Egypt. Numbers chapter 9. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert in the first month of the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, speak, and let the children of Israel keep Pascha at its appointed time, as Passover. On the 14th day of the month at eventide, you shall keep it the appointed time. According to its rule and practice, you shall keep it. So Moses told the children of Israel to keep Pascha. So this is picking up immediately after the events of Exodus 40. So this is the beginning of the first month of the second year. So this picks up right where we left off in Exodus chapter 40, and he says, all right, so the calendar, the year's coming around again, and what you need to do is on the 10th day of the month, you select the lamb. On the 14th day of the month, you sacrifice. This is the second Passover that God had told them, you need to do this every year, but he reminded them again. So the story picks up right exactly where it left off. In Numbers chapter 1, Numbers starts off, the book of Numbers starts off a month after this. Numbers chapter 1 and verse 1. Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of testimony on the first day of the second month in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel. So the census takes place after the second Passover. So the events in Numbers chapter 1 take place after the events of Numbers chapter 9. So then near the end of the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 33, I'll put the reference in notes, Aaron dies on Mount Hor, and there it says that he is dying in the 40th year of the wilderness journey. So you're starting off in the beginning of the second year, and you're ending up in the 40th year. So you got 39 years in the wilderness, roughly covering that period. In the book of Deuteronomy, book of Leviticus, it says in the book of Leviticus that is given while Israel is camped at Mount Sinai. So you know that's during that 10-month period. When God gave the instructions, he gave more things in Leviticus. And then the book of Deuteronomy, Moses' farewell address, and if you look at the beginning of Deuteronomy chapter 1, it's obviously this is near the end of the 40th year, where the people are encamped across the Jordan from Jericho. So that's basically that. This is the outline. So first part, 2 months going from the Passover to Mount Sinai, 10 months at Mount Sinai. That's the end of the book of Exodus. Book of Numbers picks up from there and takes the people from the first year, from 1 year out to the 40th year. And then Moses gives the recap before he dies in the book of Deuteronomy. So that's basically outlined. So let's pick up Numbers chapter 1. So now we have the time frame of when these things take place. Now the Lord, Numbers chapter 1, verse 1, through the first 4 verses, the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tabernacle of testimony in the first day of the second month in the second year after they came out of the land of Egypt, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel, according to their families by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, by their head count, every male from 20 years old and above, all who go out with the army of Israel. You and Aaron shall number them by their armies. With you there shall be each man according to the tribe of each ruler and their fathers' houses. So he goes on from there, and then in verse 17, it says, then Moses and Aaron took these men who've been mentioned by name. They assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month of the second year, and they registered their ancestry by families, their father's house according to the number of names from 20 years old and above, every male according to the head count. And the manner the Lord commanded Moses, so he numbered them in the wilderness of Sinai. So this is a census. It's men only that they're counting, and they're counting those who are 20 years old and older. This is a military type of census. So who would be eligible of fighting age. So it didn't include women, no children under 20. no young men under 20, and the census is organized by tribe and by family. And then we're not going to read all the rest of this chapter here, except in the conclusion, verses 45 and 46. So it says, so the entire census of the children of Israel with their armies, and from 20 years old and above, all who were able to go out to war in Israel was 603,550. So very, very specific number. 603,550. And remember in Exodus chapter 12, it talked about, it says 600,000 people departed from Egypt, as well as the rabble, the mixed multitude. This is the Jews, 600,000 round number. And it says that as well as some Egyptians who were tagging along, the mixed multitude going along with it, Exodus 12:37. So I assume that was a round number estimate, but here you get the actual head count. The other thing is Levi was not included in the census. So you have depending how you take the tribe of Joseph and split it into two, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so they have 12 tribes, not including Levi. Verse 47, but the Levites from their father's tribe were not numbered with the children of Israel. For the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, see to it the tribe of Levi is not numbered, nor take a census of them among the children of Israel. But you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of testimony, over all its furnishing and all the things that belong to it. They shall preserve the tabernacle and all its furnishings. They shall minister liturgically in the tabernacle and camp around it. So the picture is the Levites, the priests come from the Levites, and also the different ministering functions of the tabernacle operation. The Levites were responsible for that. Their job was not to be involved in the army in a warlike situation here. So I don't know, maybe this is a foreshadowing of the idea that Christians would be non-resistant. Here we're the priests of God, and where our lives are set apart to be focused on ministering to the holy things. So I don't know, but that could very well be. So Levites were not included in this census, and when the tabernacle was set up, the Levites would be not only attending to the tabernacle, but they are the ones, they have the front row seats. They're the inner circle. They're the ones that are closest to guarding the tabernacle area. That's the picture here. So, it's a basic question. Why do you think God is insisting on taking a census of all the people? Okay? It sounds like a military census, but who are these people going to fight? Really, at this point in time, are they about to go to battle against somebody? Well, not really. I mean, they sent some people out to explore the Canaan, but shortly after this, but no one actually went in to fight there. So why would God insist on a military type of census at the beginning? Okay? And then, why would God have a census again at the very end of the 40 years? Okay. And I think about this in connection, if all this is written for our benefit, think about this in connection with the story in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that Paul talked about. Okay? The two censuses that were taken, one is all the men who were 20 years and older who came out of Egypt in the beginning, and the other one is at the end of the 40 years they take another census. Guess how many names of these 605,000, whatever, guess how many names on the first census showed up on the second one? 2. That's it. Everybody else died. So somebody who was 20 years old, 40 years later, they're only 60. I mean, it's not that old. I think there's some doubters in the room here. 60's not that old, believe me, it's not that old. So 60 years old. I mean, you should have a few more years of life, good life left in you, right? But at 60 years old, they're all dead. Okay, they've all died before that time. In the first census, they take all the numbers. There's only 2 people that are counted among that number in the second census. So it puts an exclamation on the point to me that God says there were 600. Okay, there were 605,550. Is that what it said? Those people there, and that's how many people there were. And we know that because they actually counted them. And 2 made it into the promised land. So, warning for us, take this seriously. All right?
Yeah.
And then it seems to me that the reason for the census was not that they're actually going off to war, but it's more like they're organized like a military force and camping out around the tabernacle. In chapter 2, it talks about, I'm going to do a quick summary. What's in chapter 2? Chapter 2, the 4 sides, the tabernacle is set up like a rectangle. The 4 sides on the east side under Judah, as mentioned first, 186,400 men, and they will break camp first. So you have the tabernacle, you have the Levites around that, and then on the east side, you have Judah and 2 other tribes with him, Issachar and Zebulun. On the south side, under Reuben, you have the tribes of Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. 151,450 men. They break camp second when the cloud lifts and they break camp and they're getting ready to march on. On the west side, under Ephraim, you have Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. 108,100 men. They break camp third. And then on the north side, under Dan, the tribes of Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, 157,600 men, and they break the camp for last. So, interesting. The first group that's mentioned is the tribe. They're under the authority of the tribe of Judah, and they're camped out on the east side. Now, what's the significance of Judah? All right, it's pretty obvious to us, but Reuben is the oldest. Reuben is the firstborn. Why doesn't he get the position of honor of being first? Now, it goes to Judah, which, of course, Judah is the tribe from which Jesus is descended. Judah is the tribe from which David and all the kings after him are descended of Judah. And, and that goes back to the prophecy of Genesis 49, before the sojourn in Egypt under Jacob, that the blessing would not go to the first, second, or third son. The great blessing would go to the 4th son, Judah. And then I notice here also it says that they're camped on the east side. What's the significance of the east? Well, east is the direction the sun is rising from, right? And there's an old Christian custom of praying. Muslims pray facing Mecca, and Orthodox Jews may pray facing Jerusalem, facing the wall. But Christians in ancient times would pray facing the east. You can face any direction you want. This is an old custom. Why would they do that? Well, Matthew 24:27. As Jesus said, as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man. So as Christians would keep watch for the coming of the Son of Man, we'd be praying facing the east, because they understood that's where he's coming from when he comes back. Okay? So Judah and the east. And even in ancient times, when they find an ancient Christian church, a lot of times they notice a Christian church, but then it's oriented towards the east. That's what the Christians would do. So I think this is, for now, this is a good place to stop. It's just an introduction. So we're through the first sentence. So you get the picture that the tabernacle is the center of the community. The Levites, the priests, are right around that, close, and the tribes are organized by number. I think this is the reason why they took the census. One of the reasons, anyway, is that they would divide them up, 3 tribes on each side. They're all different sizes to be there by number. And there may be other reasons as well, but that's one that jumps out to me, rather than they're actually going to war anytime soon. So we'll stop there, but I hope that this has whet your appetite for more things to come. We'll make it through the censuses and the rules in the beginning, and then we'll get into some very gripping stories here with significant application for us and for that.